Welcome back to Sleepy Time History. Tonight, we're taking a long, slow walk through the chilling realities that lay beneath the surface of the seemingly romantic medieval wedding. Forget the grand feasts and the troubadours. We are going to focus on the ledger books, the legal clauses, and the cold, hard economic calculations that truly defined the union of a man and a woman in the Middle Ages. Our focus is on the dowry and the dower, two financial instruments that were absolutely central to a medieval woman's life, and often the source of her deepest anxiety, particularly surrounding that dreaded first night. Before we drift into the details, if you find yourself here often, letting the weight of the past lull you to sleep, please take a moment to tap that like button and subscribe. It's the only way this quiet corner of history stays alive. And if you have a question about medieval economics, leave a comment below. I'll try to weave it into a future story. The medieval marriage, particularly amongst the nobility and wealthy bourgeoisie, was fundamentally a financial transaction, a strategic alliance disguised in silks and ceremony. A young woman's worth was not measured by her character or beauty, but by the assets she brought to the marriage. This was the dowry, dos in Latin, and it was perhaps the heaviest burden and the greatest source of security she would ever possess. The dowry was not a simple gift. It was a transfer of property, money, or goods from the bride's family to the groom or his family, intended to help the couple establish their new household, but legally, it was often absorbed into the husband's patrimony. Consider a young woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Though her story is far from boring, the underlying economic mechanics are a perfect illustration. When she married the future Louis VII of France, her dowry was the entire vast Duchy of Aquitaine itself, an almost unimaginable fortune. For a lesser noblewoman, the dowry might be a productive estate, a sum of silver coin, or a valuable collection of linens and livestock. The anxiety surrounding the dowry was intense, not only for the bride, but for her entire family. Its size determined her status, the caliber of husband she could attract, and the respect she would command in her new home. A smaller dowry meant a less advantageous match and a lifetime of lower status and fewer resources. The negotiation of the dowry was a painstaking process, often involving months of legal wrangling between the two families' representatives. It was a battle fought with parchment and wax seals. Not swords, but the stakes were just as high. Lawyers and notaries painstakingly detailed every item, every parcel of land, ensuring that the valuation was fair and the terms of transfer were legally sound. This was a process entirely devoid of romantic sentiment, a cold, rational assessment of assets. For the bride, the knowledge that her entire future was being tallied and calculated, laid bare on a long scroll of vellum, must have been utterly dehumanizing, stripping the coming wedding of any joy. But there was a counterweight to the dowry, a crucial safeguard for the woman, particularly in later medieval law, known as the dower. While the dowry was her contribution to the marriage, the dower was the husband's pledge to his wife, a portion of his own estate, typically 1/3, that was legally set aside for her use, should he predecease her. This was the woman's insurance policy, her sole means of financial independence, should she become a widow. The establishment of the dower was often confirmed on the wedding day itself, sometimes, though not universally, after the marriage had been consummated. And here, we arrive at a significant source of the wedding night dread. The legality of the dower, this vital piece of the woman's future security, was often intrinsically linked to the consummation of the marriage. In many legal traditions, the marriage was not considered fully binding, or the dower fully confirmed, until the couple had engaged in sexual intercourse. This created a profound pressure. The wedding night was not just a private moment, it was a public expectation, an economic necessity, a final sealing of the contract. Failure to consummate whether due to the groom's impotence, the bride's unwillingness, or other unforeseen circumstances, could potentially nullify the marriage, and more terrifyingly for the woman, jeopardize her right to the dower, leaving her financially exposed and without the essential means of survival as a widow. Imagine the young bride, already overwhelmed by the spectacle of the wedding, the stress of leaving her family, and the total uncertainty of her new life. Now, on top of this, she carries the knowledge that the secure future of her family and her own survival as a widow hinges on the successful completion of this single pressurized act. The dowry was secured, but the dower, her safety net, her freedom, was awaiting confirmation. In some regions, particularly those influenced by Germanic law, the bride price, or Morgengabe, morning gift, was also a feature. This was a gift of property or money given by the husband to the wife on the morning after the wedding night, specifically recognizing the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. This public display of a financial transaction, immediately following the private act, further underscores the economic and physical scrutiny placed upon the bride. Her body, her purity, and her financial security were all inextricably linked, judged, and monetized. Section 2. The humiliating courtship, annulments, and the battle over impotence. The wedding feast is over. The guests have departed, and the hopeful whispers have turned to anxious silence. A week passes, then 2, with no announcement of a successful consummation. The air in the castle grows thick with tension. For a medieval woman, the failure of her wedding night was not a private tragedy. It was a public humiliation with catastrophic legal and financial consequences. The marriage was in jeopardy, and so was her dowry, and with it, her family's honor and economic stability. Section 2. The humiliating courtship, annulments, and the battle over impotence. The burden of proof, in cases of non-consummation, often fell on the bride. While the man's impotence was the legal grounds for annulment, the woman was forced to endure a humiliating and invasive process to prove it. This was not a quick or private affair. In an age where the church held immense power over matrimonial law, a marriage could only be dissolved through a lengthy and often torturous ecclesiastical court proceeding. The process was a public spectacle, and it was designed to be as difficult as possible to prevent frivolous or self-serving annulments. The first step was an official complaint, usually lodged by the groom's family, who feared losing the dowry, or the bride's family, who wanted her back and their property returned. The court, made up of bishops and canon lawyers, would then launch an investigation. The most intrusive and dreaded part of this process was the physical examination. The church insisted on a thorough investigation to determine if either party was capable of coitus. For the man, this could involve an inspection by a panel of physicians or midwives, a degrading public spectacle known as the Congressus test. Witnesses would be summoned to testify on his virility or lack thereof. The historical record is full of bizarre and often salacious accounts of men being forced to demonstrate their ability, or inability, in front of a jury. For the woman, the examination was arguably worse. She would be inspected by a panel of matrons and midwives to determine if her hymen was intact, or if there were other physical signs of non-consummation. The very act of this inquiry was a violation, turning her body into a piece of evidence, a battleground for two families' financial interests. The medieval mind, ever superstitious, also entertained the possibility of witchcraft or enchantment. It was believed that a malevolent spell, a ligamentum, could be cast upon a man, preventing him from performing his marital duties with his new wife, even if he were perfectly capable with others. The legal proceedings sometimes included prayers, exorcisms, and even bizarre rituals aimed at breaking the supposed curse. Consider the case of Edward II of England and his wife. Isabella of France. Though their marriage was consummated, a later case involving his son, Edward the Thurger's brother, John of Eltham, and his wife, provides a glimpse into these legal struggles. John was reportedly impotent, and the legal wrangling over their unconsummated marriage was a matter of national importance. These cases highlight the fact that such personal failures were never truly private. The prestige of noble families and the succession of royal lines all hinged on the successful consummation of a marriage. If the court found the man to be permanently and incurably impotent, the marriage could be annulled. This was not a divorce, which was almost non-existent in the Middle Ages, but a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. The woman would then be free to marry again, and her dowry, after a potential legal battle, would be returned to her family. But this outcome was far from a guarantee, and the woman's reputation would be permanently damaged, regardless of the court's ruling. She had failed to be a proper wife, a woman who could not bind a man to her. The financial fallout was immense. The dowry, which may have been invested or spent, now had to be returned. If the dowry included land, crops might have been harvested, tenants changed, and the land's value altered. The legal battle over its return could drag on for years, impoverishing both families. For the woman, the process was a long, painful journey through the public eye, with her most intimate life dissected in a cold, judgmental courtroom. She was a pawn in a larger game of power and property. The ultimate irony of the situation was that the one person with the most to lose, the woman herself, was often the one with the least power to control the outcome. Her fate was in the hands of men, her father, her husband, and the male judges of the church court. Her body, her future, her financial security were all subject to their scrutiny and decision. The shame and anxiety that came with this knowledge must have been an unbearable weight. So, as we conclude this section, think about the medieval bride, not as a blushing maiden, but as a young woman, a human being, who was painfully aware that her very worth, her future, and the honor of her entire family rested on the successful completion of an act that she had no control over, an act that could, and often did, become the subject of a humiliating legal battle. But what if the problem wasn't a physical one, but a mental one? What if the fear itself, the intense pressure, made consummation impossible? And what happened to the men who faced their own public shame in a society where a man's honor was so closely tied to his virility? Section 3. The weight of expectation. When the mind becomes the obstacle. The final curtain falls on the tumultuous legal drama of a medieval annulment. The ecclesiastical court has heard the testimony, scrutinized the evidence, and made its judgment. The woman is either granted her freedom, along with the return of her family's dowry, or she is forced to remain in a legally unconsummated marriage, a state of limbo that effectively ends her social life and future prospects. Yet, beyond the cold facts of the law, a deeper, more profound truth was at play. A truth that spoke to the immense psychological toll of the wedding night. The pressure on the medieval groom was no less intense than on his bride. A man's virility was a cornerstone of his social identity and honor. To fail at consummating his marriage was not merely a personal disappointment. It was a public shaming that cast doubt on his manliness and his ability to secure his lineage. The fear of public ridicule, the anxiety of performing on demand, and the weight of his family's hopes all converged on him in that private chamber. It's entirely plausible that this immense psychological burden could have caused a temporary or even long-term impotence, a problem of the mind, not the body. In an age with no understanding of modern psychology, this was a terrifying and inexplicable phenomenon. This is where the concept of ligature, or tying the knot, takes on a deeper, more tragic meaning. While some believed it was the result of a malevolent spell, it could have been a cultural explanation for a real psychological issue. The fear itself, a form of performance anxiety, could have been the very spell that prevented the act. In a society that believed in the power of curses and supernatural forces, it was far easier to blame an external evil than to confront the fragile and complex nature of the human psyche. The wedding night was also a moment of intense emotional vulnerability for the bride. She was leaving everything she had ever known to enter a new world where her status and security were completely dependent on a man she barely knew. For a young woman, often little more than a child, this was a terrifying prospect. The loss of her autonomy, the submission to her husband's authority, and the sexual unknown were all wrapped up in a single, deeply symbolic act. This emotional and mental stress could also have contributed to the difficulties of consummation. It was a shared vulnerability, even if it was rarely spoken of in those terms. The dread was not just of the physical act, but of what the act represented. The final, irreversible transition from a daughter in her father's house to a wife in her husband's, with all the legal and social consequences that entailed. In the end, the history of the medieval wedding night is not a story of romance or fairy tales. It is a stark reminder of the harsh economic and social realities of the time. The dowry and dower were not just legal documents. They were the very foundation of a woman's security and a family's power. The wedding night was the public confirmation of this transaction, a final, nerve-wracking test that could lead to either a life of stability or a future of shame and ruin. So, as we reflect on this deeply boring but profoundly significant piece of history, we see a powerful lesson. The most personal moments of our lives are often shaped by the most impersonal forces: law, money, and social convention. For the medieval woman, her wedding night was not a moment of joy, but a moment of dread. A night where the weight of her family's fortunes and her own future hung in the balance. The unadorned truth of her experience, hidden beneath the grand narratives of kings and castles, tells a story of human resilience in the face of immense pressure. It reminds us that even in the most seemingly romantic moments of history, the quiet, unspoken anxieties of ordinary life often tell the most compelling stories. Story 2. The Bedding Ceremony, Public Spectacle and Private Terror Section. 1. The Public Procession to the Marital Bed. The first story was a quiet look at the cold, hard numbers that lay beneath the surface of a medieval marriage. We delved into the legal clauses and the economic anxieties that haunted the medieval bride. Now, we turn our attention from the parchment of the marriage contract to the physical space of the bedchamber itself, and a ritual that turned the most intimate of moments into a grand, and often terrifying, public spectacle. We are here to talk about the bedding ceremony, a bizarre and forgotten tradition that once marked the conclusion of every noble and royal wedding. This was not a private farewell at the end of the evening, but a formal procession and ritual, a climax to the day's events, that was both a celebration and a legal necessity. The bedding ceremony, a tradition that faded in the late Middle Ages but was once a common practice across Europe, was the final public act of a marriage contract. It served a single, crucial purpose: to provide witnesses to the fact that the bride and groom were actually placed together in the same bed, a symbolic, and sometimes literal, confirmation that the marriage was on its way to being consummated. The ceremony began after the wedding feast had wound down. The bride and groom were led by their respective families and guests to the marital chamber. This was not a quick or quiet walk, it was a noisy procession, a loud, boisterous parade. The men of the groom's party and the women of the bride's party would accompany the couple, filling the halls with raucous laughter, bawdy songs, and, often, drunken cheers. For the bride, this must have been a deeply unsettling experience, a feeling of being paraded, like an animal on display, towards a destiny she had little say in. Once inside the bedchamber, the ritual truly began. The women of the bride's party would assist her in undressing and preparing for bed. In some accounts, This was a gentle, reassuring process, but in others, it was a continuation of the public spectacle, with onlookers offering lewd comments and ribald jokes. At the same time, the men would assist the groom, often teasing him about his upcoming duties. It was a complete reversal of our modern understanding of privacy, a total lack of it, at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The culmination of this undressing was the moment the couple was finally, literally, bedded. The women would help the bride into the bed first, and then the men would help the groom join her. The onlookers would then offer a series of final blessings and prayers for fertility and a long and happy life, before a final cheer as they withdrew, leaving the couple alone. But they were not entirely alone. It was common practice for a group of witnesses, often a few trusted male and female relatives, to remain in the room, or just outside the door, for a period of time. Their role was simple: to wait for a sign, a sound, a whisper that would indicate the marriage had been successfully initiated. In some cases, a bowl of milk and a loaf of bread would be left outside the door, a symbolic gesture of sustenance, or a hint at the hope for a future family. The historical record is full of accounts of this ceremony. We have records from the wedding of King Henry VII of England and Elizabeth of York, the very union that ended the Wars of the Roses. Their bedding ceremony was a matter of state importance. Nobles, courtiers, and even the royal chaplain were present to witness them being put to bed. This was not a private moment. It was a symbolic act of peace, of political union, and of the continuation of a dynasty. But what was the practical, everyday reality of this tradition for the average noblewoman? The humiliation of being undressed in front of strangers, the lewd comments, the pressure of knowing that her every move was being watched and judged. The marriage bed, which should have been a place of privacy and intimacy, was an auditorium, a stage for a very personal performance. The very act of undressing, a moment of trust between two people, was instead a public act of display. For a young woman who had been raised to be modest and chaste, this must have been an experience of extreme terror and shame. The ceremony was not just about watching. It was also about legal testimony. The witnesses present could later testify in a court of law that they had seen the couple in bed together. This was considered crucial evidence in the event of a later dispute over the marriage's validity or the legitimacy of a future child. This legal angle turns the spectacle from a strange custom into a cold, calculated exercise in public record-keeping. The bedding ceremony was an early form of a legal deposition, conducted in the most intimate of settings. So, we are left with a single, haunting image: a young woman and a young man, alone at last, but with the echo of their guests' laughter still ringing in their ears, the smell of wine and food still heavy in the air, and the knowledge that the eyes of their families and the law were still metaphorically upon them, even in the silence of the night. This ritual, so deeply a part of medieval life, speaks to a profound absence of personal space, a total immersion of the individual into the collective needs of the family and the state. But what happened the morning after? What was the significance of the public announcement of the successful first night? And what were the consequences of a failure to do so? A failure that was now a matter of public knowledge. Section 2. The morning after and the dower's confirmation. The clamor of the bedding ceremony has faded, leaving a silence in the marital chamber that is as heavy as the expectations that preceded it. The sun rises on the morning after, and with it, a new, equally public ritual begins. This was a moment of immense importance for the bride. The morning after the consummation, the groom would traditionally present his new wife with a morning gift, or a morgengabe. This gift was not a simple token of affection. It was a formal and legally significant transfer of property, a key component of her dower rights, and a public declaration of the successful consummation of the marriage. The value and type of the morning gift varied greatly depending on the couple's social status. For a queen or a high noblewoman, it could be a valuable estate, a castle, or a large sum of money. For a woman of the gentry, it might be a few acres of land, a small manor, or a herd of cattle. The purpose of this gift was to provide the woman with an independent source of income and property for her lifetime, particularly in the event of her husband's death. It was her legal security, and its presentation on the morning after the wedding was a symbolic and very real confirmation of her new status as a wife and the successful start of her new family. The very act of giving it was a public declaration that the marriage was now fully, legally, and physically binding. The presentation of the morning gift was often a small, private ceremony, but its significance was far-reaching and widely known. The new wife was now a landowner, a person of means in her own right, no longer fully dependent on her father or her husband's family. This new legal and economic standing was a direct result of the events of the previous night. But what if the morning after did not bring forth this gift? The absence of a morning gift was a very public and damning statement about the failure of the wedding night. It would signal to the entire community that the marriage was not consummated, plunging both families back into the anxieties we discussed in the previous story. The public shame of non-consummation was a heavy burden for both the bride and the groom, but the consequences for the woman were often more severe. She would be seen as a woman who could not hold her husband, and her family's honor would be questioned. Her future was now shrouded in uncertainty, with the possibility of a long and humiliating legal battle to reclaim her dowry. Her value in the marriage market would plummet, and her chances of a future match would be slim. The public knowledge of non-consummation was the true terror of the bedding ceremony. The public knew when the couple was put to bed, and when they emerged the next morning, the status of their marriage was an open secret. There were no hushed whispers. The failure was a loud, clear, and visible fact. This created an immense pressure on the couple to not only consummate the marriage, but to do so quickly and efficiently, as the entire community was waiting for a sign of success. The church, in its wisdom, understood the psychological pressure and offered a small concession. In cases of doubt or failure, the couple was sometimes granted a period of time, often 3 years, to attempt consummation. This was a last resort, a period of legal purgatory where the marriage's validity hung in the balance. It was a time of immense anxiety for the couple and a time of public scrutiny for their families. But it was a rare mercy in an unforgiving legal and social landscape. The truth is, the medieval wedding night was an act of high-stakes theater. The bedding ceremony was the final act of that play, and the morning gift was the curtain call. The entire community was a witness, and the stakes were a woman's future, a family's honor, and the continuation of a bloodline. The dreaded wedding night was not a single moment in time, but a long, drawn-out performance that began with the signing of a contract and ended with the presentation of a gift, or the silence of its absence. But what about the men? While a man's failure to perform was a great shame, it was not the end of his world. He could simply try again with a new wife, provided his family was willing to face another dowry negotiation. But for the woman, a failure to consummate often meant the end of her life as a wife, and the beginning of a life of shame and social obscurity. What was her life like after an annulment? And what became of a woman who was considered unmarriageable? Section 3. The Aftermath. The Fate of the Unbedded Bride. The sun has risen, the morning gift has not been given, and the public has become aware of the failure to consummate the marriage. For the unbedded bride, the future was grim and uncertain. She was now in a state of legal and social limbo, neither a wife nor a fully free woman. Her reputation was in tatters, and her family was plunged into a desperate struggle to reclaim the dowry and restore their honor. The path forward was a treacherous one, fraught with legal battles, public humiliation, and the very real possibility of a life in social obscurity. The first and most immediate consequence was the legal battle for the dowry. This was not a simple matter of returning a bag of coin, As we discussed earlier, the dowry often consisted of land, livestock, and other valuable assets that had already been integrated into the groom's family estate. The legal proceedings to reclaim it could drag on for years, with lawyers and notaries poring over every last detail of the marriage contract. The woman herself was a passive observer in this process, her fate in the hands of the men who controlled her life. Even if the dowry was successfully returned, the woman's reputation was forever tarnished. She was now a failed bride, a woman who could not fulfill her most basic marital duty. In a society where a woman's value was intrinsically tied to her ability to produce an heir, her unconsummated marriage was a mark of shame. Her chances of finding another husband, especially one of equal or higher status, were almost non-existent. She was a liability, a reminder of a humiliating past and a source of potential legal trouble. In some cases, the failed bride would be sent to a convent. This was a common solution for families who wanted to avoid the shame of a daughter living as a spinster in their home. The convent provided a safe and respectable place for her to live out her life, away from the prying eyes of society. But it was a life without personal agency or freedom. She would be a nun, her life dedicated to God, but her true purpose was to be hidden from the world. This was a fate of quiet desperation, a life lived in the shadows of a family's shame. For the groom, the consequences were far less severe. He could simply seek a new bride, perhaps one with an even larger dowry, provided his family was willing to overlook the embarrassment of the annulment. His honor was wounded, but his future was not irrevocably damaged. The double standard was stark and unforgiving. A man's virility was his to prove, but a woman's failure was a public and permanent stain on her character. The story of the bedding ceremony and its aftermath is a powerful reminder of how public and controlled a woman's life was in the Middle Ages. Her body was not her own. It was a vessel for her family's honor and a tool for their economic and social advancement. The wedding night and the public rituals that surrounded it were a final, terrifying test. Success meant a life of security and status. Failure meant a life of shame and social death. The boring details of legal documents and public rituals reveal a history of profound human vulnerability and a society where a woman's worth was measured not by her character or intelligence, but by her ability to fulfill her role as a wife and future mother. This story of public spectacle and private terror is a chilling counterpoint to the romanticized image of the medieval wedding. It reminds us that behind every grand ceremony lay a network of anxieties and legal realities that shaped the lives of ordinary people. The medieval wedding night was not a moment of quiet romance, but a high-stakes public performance where a woman's future hung in the balance. And for many, the dread of that night was not just of the unknown, but of the very real possibility of failure and the life of shame that would follow. Story 3. The Handfasting and the Church's Iron Grip. When is a marriage really a marriage? Section 1. The Promise of the Heart versus the Law of the Church. We have explored the financial and public pressures of a medieval wedding. Now, let's turn to a different kind of anxiety, the very definition of what constituted a marriage in the first place. The medieval period was a time of immense legal and religious confusion. The church was still solidifying its power, and local customs often clashed with ecclesiastical law. For a young couple, this meant that the simple act of getting married was fraught with legal ambiguity and the potential for disaster. The central conflict was between handfasting, a traditional, often non-religious, marriage ceremony, and the church's increasingly iron grip over the institution of marriage. Handfasting was an ancient custom with roots in Celtic and Germanic traditions. It was a simple ceremony where a man and a woman would hold hands and exchange vows of commitment. The very name comes from the act of fastening hands. It was often a public promise, a verbal contract made in front of witnesses, but it did not require a priest or a church. This form of marriage was common among the lower classes and in more remote areas. where a priest might not be readily available. It was a practical solution to a human need, a way for two people to formalize their relationship and live together as husband and wife. The key legal element was verba de presenti, the words of the present tense. A simple statement like, "I take you as my wife," or "I take you as my husband." If these words were exchanged, the couple was considered married in the eyes of local custom and, for a time, even some aspects of canon law. But as the Church grew more powerful, it sought to centralize its control over all aspects of Christian life, and marriage was a primary target. The Church saw handfasting and other informal unions as a threat to its authority and a source of moral chaos. It began to push for a more formal and rigid definition of marriage. The Council of Trent, a major reform council in the 16th century, finally declared that a valid marriage required a priest and a public ceremony in a church. But for centuries leading up to this point, the legal landscape was a confusing mess of conflicting ideas. A marriage could be considered valid in one community, but not in another, or valid in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the law. This legal ambiguity created immense anxiety and opportunity for exploitation. A man could promise marriage through handfasting, live with a woman as his wife, and then abandon her, claiming the marriage was never valid because it was not performed in a church. A woman, often poor and without a family to protect her, would have no legal recourse. Her social status would be ruined, and she would be a fallen woman, with no legal right to her children, or to any of her partner's property. The absence of a formal, publicly witnessed ceremony meant that her promise of the heart was worthless in a court of law. For the woman, this legal ambiguity was a source of constant dread. She might believe she was legally married, only to find out later that her partner considered their union a temporary arrangement. The Church's struggle for control meant that the most intimate of relationships became a battleground for legal and religious authority. The simple act of saying, "I do," was not enough. It was a terrifying realization for a woman who had staked her entire future on a promise made in good faith. She could be a wife in her heart, but a concubine in the eyes of the law. Her children considered illegitimate, and her life's work unrewarded. The tension between these two forms of marriage, the traditional and the religious, highlights the struggle for power between local custom and centralized authority. The Church's push for control was not just about morality. It was about power. It was about creating a system where the Church was the sole arbiter of what was and was not a legitimate family. For the average woman, this was not an abstract legal debate. It was a matter of life and death, of honor and shame, of security and ruin. But what happened when a man with a handfasted wife entered into a formal, church-sanctioned marriage with another woman? The legal chaos that ensued led to some of the most dramatic and devastating court cases of the medieval period. Section 2. The Bigamy Trial and the Church's Judgment. The legal ambiguity surrounding handfasting and formal marriage came to a head in the ecclesiastical courts. A man might live with a woman and even have children with her under a handfasting agreement. He would then, for financial or social reasons, seek a more advantageous marriage with a second woman, this time in a church with a priest. This was the ultimate betrayal for the first woman and a legal nightmare for all involved. This was not a simple case of infidelity. It was a matter of bigamy, a crime in the eyes of the Church with severe penalties, and a legal question that could unravel a family's entire social and economic standing. The Church's position, while often confusing, was ultimately rooted in a desire to centralize its authority. It argued that a marriage was a sacrament, a divine union that could not be broken. The words verba de presenti were key. If two people had exchanged these words, even without a priest, the marriage was considered a valid and binding contract in the eyes of God. This doctrine, while seemingly supportive of the handfasted woman, often became a legal trap. If the first marriage was deemed valid, the second marriage was considered void, and the children of that union were illegitimate. The ensuing legal trial was a source of public spectacle and immense anxiety. The hand-fasted woman, now a plaintiff, would have to prove that a valid verbal contract had been made. She would call witnesses who had heard the vows or who had seen the couple living together as man and wife. The man, in turn, would argue that the vows were not serious or that they were conditional. This was a battle of he said, she said, and the outcomes were never certain. For the first woman, the stakes were impossibly high. If she lost, she would be branded a concubine. Her children would be illegitimate, and she would have no legal claim to her partner's property. If she won, she would be a wife, but a wife who had to endure the public humiliation of a trial and the lifelong bitterness of a husband who had tried to abandon her. Consider a case from the late medieval period. A woman named Marjorie Kempe, a famous mystic, was accused by a priest of not being married to her husband, John Kempe, because they had not been married in a church. This was a common accusation, highlighting the deep-seated tension between custom and canon law. Marjorie, a fiercely independent woman, fought back, citing the verba de presenti. She won her case, but the incident illustrates the daily anxieties faced by couples who lived under the shadow of a potentially invalid marriage. For the woman in a hand-fasted union, her life was a constant source of anxiety. Was she a wife? Would her children be legitimate? What would happen if her partner died or abandoned her? These questions, so central to her identity and security, were entirely dependent on the whims of a legal system that was still in its formative stages. The Church's struggle for control, while a matter of abstract theology to a canon lawyer, was a matter of life and death to the women who were caught in the crossfire. The very concept of a family, the most basic unit of medieval society, was in a state of flux. The Church's push for a standardized, church-sanctioned marriage was a way to bring order to this chaos, but it left countless people in a state of legal limbo. The story of hand-fasting is a story of tradition clashing with power and the women caught in the middle. The bigamy trials were the bitter fruits of this conflict, and they were a source of profound dread for any woman who had placed her faith in a simple promise. But what happened when a priest, a man of God, was the one to break a hand-fasting vow? What was the fate of the woman who had trusted in a man of the cloth only to be abandoned by him? Section 3. The Priest and the Fallen Woman. A Betrayal of Faith. The legal and social chaos of hand-fasting reached its tragic climax in cases where one of the parties was a member of the clergy. The Church, while demanding that its lay followers adhere to its strict matrimonial laws, had its own internal struggles with clerical celibacy. Despite the official doctrine that priests were to remain unmarried, the practice was widespread, particularly in the early medieval period and in rural areas. A priest might enter into a hand-fasting agreement with a woman, and the two would live together as husband and wife, their union recognized by the local community if not by the Church's high offices. This created a new layer of dread for the woman involved. The betrayal was not just a legal one, but a betrayal of faith. A woman who was hand-fasted to a priest was in an incredibly precarious position. She had put her trust in a man of God, believing their union was blessed, even if not officially sanctioned. Her social standing was precarious, and her children, even if loved and recognized by the community, were illegitimate in the eyes of the Church. The priest, in turn, was vulnerable to a changing political climate within the Church. If a new bishop or abbot came to power who was stricter about clerical celibacy, the priest could be forced to abandon his wife and children to maintain his position. The fate of the woman in these cases was devastating. She was a woman without a husband, a family without a father, and a person who had been used and abandoned by a man who was supposed to be a moral leader. She had no legal recourse. The Church would not recognize their marriage and would not force the priest to provide for her or their children. Her hand-fasting, which she had believed to be a solemn vow, was worthless in the face of the Church's internal politics. She was left to fend for herself, with no reputation and no means of support. The story of handfasting is not just a legal history, it is a human history of trust and betrayal. It shows us how the most personal of relationships were shaped by the power struggles of the time. The Church's desire to centralize its power over marriage had a direct and devastating impact on the lives of ordinary people. The ambiguity of the law created a space for exploitation, and the women who were caught in this legal and social limbo paid the highest price. Their lives were a testament to the fact that for a medieval woman, her very existence was not her own, but was a function of the laws and customs that governed her world. The dread of the handfasted woman was a quiet, insidious one, the fear that her entire life's foundation was built on a promise that could be broken at any moment. This is a reminder that even in the most seemingly boring of historical details, there is a deep and compelling human story waiting to be told. Story 4. The High Price of Childbirth. Survival and Succession in the Castle. Section 1. A Painful Necessity. The High Stakes of Birth and the Anxieties of Succession. We have explored the financial and legal anxieties that surrounded a medieval woman's wedding and early marriage. Now, we turn to the next great source of dread in her life: childbirth. For a medieval woman, this was not a joyous occasion, but a life-threatening ordeal, a moment of immense physical pain and a high-stakes gamble for her family's future. The dread of childbirth was a universal experience, but for the noblewoman, it was intensified by the crushing weight of expectation and the need to produce a legitimate male heir. The statistics were grim. It is estimated that a significant percentage of women died during or shortly after childbirth. The lack of sanitation, medical knowledge, and effective pain relief made the birthing chamber one of the most dangerous places a woman could be. Infections like puerperal fever were rampant, and a difficult or prolonged labor could lead to the death of both mother and child. For a woman, the fear was not just of the physical pain, but of the very real possibility that she would not survive. For a noblewoman, the stakes were even higher. Her entire purpose in life, her value to her husband and his family, was to produce an heir. A son was not just a child, he was the future of the family, the continuation of the bloodline, and the security of the estate. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense. A noblewoman who produced only daughters was often seen as a failure, and her marriage could be in jeopardy. The fear of not producing a son was a constant, gnawing anxiety that overshadowed her entire life. The birthing process itself was a complex ritual, steeped in superstition and religious practice. The woman in labor, or lying in, was surrounded by female relatives, friends, and midwives. Men were almost never present. The chamber would be filled with prayers, relics of saints, and various charms believed to ease the pain and protect the mother and child. The birthing chair, a common tool of the time, was often used to assist in the delivery. But these rituals and tools offered little comfort in the face of a complicated birth. The dread was not just of the physical pain, it was of the unknown. A woman could be in labor for days, and there was no way of knowing if she would survive. The moment of birth was a moment of truth, a gamble with her life and her family's future. The survival of a son was a cause for immense celebration, but the death of a mother was a quiet tragedy, a reminder of the fragility of life and the high price of succession. The very concept of a family, a lineage, and a dynasty all rested on the shoulders of the woman in labor. Her body was the battlefield where the future of her family was decided. The anxieties of the wedding night and the legal battles that followed paled in comparison to the existential dread of childbirth. It was a terrifying reality, a moment of physical and emotional torment that a medieval woman was expected to endure, for the good of her family and the continuation of her bloodline. But what happened when a noblewoman died in childbirth, leaving behind a baby who was not a boy? What was the fate of a motherless daughter, and how did a father secure his lineage without a new bride? Section 2. The motherless daughter and the father's desperate gamble. The dreaded outcome has occurred. A noblewoman has died in childbirth, leaving behind a frail baby girl. This was a double tragedy in the medieval mind. The loss of the mother was a profound personal loss, but the lack of a male heir was a dynastic catastrophe. The father, now a widower, was faced with a stark and unforgiving reality. He had no son to carry on his name and secure his lineage. The pressure on him was immense, and his actions in the aftermath of his wife's death would determine the future of his family for generations to come. The first and most immediate problem was the care of the motherless daughter. In a society where a woman's life was defined by marriage, a motherless girl was in an incredibly precarious position. Her care was often entrusted to a wet nurse, a woman who had recently given birth and could breastfeed the baby. But the long-term prospects were uncertain. Without a mother to guide her in the intricacies of a noblewoman's life, the management of a household, the social graces, and the preparation for a future marriage, her future was in jeopardy. She was a burden, a reminder of her mother's failure to produce a male heir, and a constant source of anxiety for her father. The father's primary concern, however, was not his daughter's future, but his own. He needed to remarry, and quickly. This was a pragmatic necessity, not a matter of romance. He had to find a new bride, a woman who could provide him with a son. The legal and social pressure to do so was immense. His family, his vassals, and his king would all be pushing him to secure his lineage. The widowed noble was a highly sought-after commodity in the marriage market, but his second marriage was a high-stakes gamble. He was looking for a woman who was young and fertile, a woman who could not only bear a son but also survive the ordeal of childbirth. This was a search that was often devoid of affection, a cold, calculated transaction where a woman was reduced to her reproductive capacity. The second marriage of a medieval nobleman was a stark contrast to his first. The first marriage was often a matter of political and social alliance, a union of two families. The second was a matter of sheer survival, a desperate attempt to secure the family's future. The dread of the second wife was a different kind of terror. She knew that her sole purpose was to produce a son. If she failed, she could be cast aside. The specter of her predecessor, the woman who had died in childbirth, would haunt her every waking moment. The knowledge that she was a replacement, a tool for procreation, was a heavy burden to bear. The story of the noblewoman who died in childbirth and the widower who was forced to remarry is a powerful reminder of the relentless pressure of succession. The lives of women were a cycle of expectation and dread. The dread of the wedding night was followed by the dread of childbirth, and for a widow, the dread of her husband's death was followed by the dread of her own. The high price of succession was paid in the bodies of women, in their pain and their deaths. The tragedy of the motherless daughter was a quiet one. Her life was a reflection of her mother's failure. She was a commodity in the marriage market, a pawn in a game of dynastic chess. Her father, desperate for a son, would likely arrange her marriage at a young age, a marriage that was not for love, but for alliance. The motherless daughter was a reminder of what could go wrong, a constant source of anxiety for a family that was desperate to secure its future. The history of childbirth in the Middle Ages is a story of immense human suffering and incredible resilience. It is a story of a society that was so obsessed with lineage and succession that it was willing to risk the lives of its women for the promise of a son. The dread of childbirth was a universal experience, but for the noblewoman, it was a terror compounded by the immense pressure of a society that saw her not as a person, but as a vessel for the future of her family. But what happened when the noblewoman, against all odds, produced a son, only to have him die in infancy? The dread of childbirth was replaced by the dread of childhood death, a terror that was even more pervasive and heartbreaking. Section 3. The Ghost of the Nursery. The pervasive dread of infancy death. The high-stakes gamble of childbirth was a moment of intense dread for the medieval woman, but it was often followed by a different kind of terror, the pervasive dread of infancy death. In an age of no vaccines, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge, a child's survival to adulthood was far from guaranteed. The first year of life was a treacherous gauntlet. And for the noblewoman, every cough, every fever, and every moment of silence from the nursery was a source of profound anxiety. The statistics on child mortality are a sobering reminder of the grim reality of medieval life. It is estimated that up to 30% of all children died before their first birthday, and a further 20% did not survive to adulthood. For a noblewoman who had survived the ordeal of childbirth and successfully produced an heir, her joy was often short-lived. The specter of death was a constant presence in the nursery, a silent stalker that could take her son at any moment. This was a fear that was both universal and deeply personal. It was a fear that was not spoken of in polite company, but it was a fear that every mother carried in her heart. The death of a child, particularly a male heir, was a catastrophe for a noble family. The future of the lineage, the security of the estate, and the family's honor all rested on the small, fragile shoulders of a single child. The loss of a son was a double tragedy, a profound personal grief and a dynastic disaster. For the mother, the grief was compounded by a sense of guilt. In a society that believed in divine providence and punishment, a child's death was often seen as a sign of God's displeasure. The mother would question her own actions, her own piety, and her own worthiness. This was a heavy burden to bear, a silent guilt that she would carry for the rest of her life. The culture of the medieval period reflected this pervasive dread. In art and literature, children were often depicted as small adults, dressed in miniature versions of their parents' clothes. This was not because medieval people did not see childhood as a distinct phase of life, but because they understood that a child's life was short and that they needed to be prepared for the realities of adulthood as quickly as possible. The very concept of childhood was a fleeting and fragile one. The high infant mortality rate also influenced how parents, particularly noble parents, interacted with their children. While there is ample evidence of profound parental love and grief, some historians argue that there was a certain emotional detachment, a subconscious defense mechanism against the inevitable pain of loss. The death of a child in the Middle Ages was not a private tragedy. It was a community event. A child's funeral was a somber procession, a reminder to all of the fragility of life and the ever-present shadow of death. The mother's grief was a public spectacle, a performance of piety and pain that was expected of her. She would mourn her child in public, and her grief was a testament to her love and her faith. But the private grief, the quiet torment, was a different matter. The mother would carry the memory of her lost child with her for the rest of her life, a ghost in the nursery that would haunt her every waking moment. The story of the medieval woman is a story of a life lived under a constant state of dread. The dread of the wedding night, the dread of childbirth, and the dread of infancy death. Her life was a series of high-stakes gambles, with her body, her honor, and her family's future all on the line. The seemingly mundane details of daily life, the act of giving birth, the quiet moments in the nursery, were, in fact, the most terrifying moments of her existence. They were a constant reminder that her life was not her own, but was a function of the laws, customs, and biological realities that governed her world. This is the unvarnished truth of medieval history, a history that is far more compelling and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. Story 5. The Silent Scourge, Hygiene, Illness, and the Medieval Bride section. 1. The Invisible Enemies, the Threat of Filth and Disease. We have journeyed through the legal, economic, and existential dreads of the medieval woman. Now let's turn our attention to an enemy she couldn't see, a source of dread that was a constant and silent presence in her daily life: disease and the lack of hygiene. For a woman entering a new household, the dread was not just of her new family or her new life, but of the invisible microbes that could take her life or the lives of her children. The medieval world was a cesspool of filth and disease. The concept of germ theory was centuries away, and people had no idea that their habits were the cause of their illnesses. For a noblewoman, this was a constant source of anxiety. While her home might have been a castle, it was far from a modern, clean environment. The air was thick with the smell of smoke. The latrine was often a simple hole in the wall that emptied onto the ground below, and the halls were filled with the waste of animals and humans alike. The lack of personal hygiene was a major source of illness. Bathing was a rare occurrence often reserved for special occasions like a wedding or a feast. People believed that hot water could open the pores and allow disease to enter the body. Instead, they would dry clean themselves with a linen cloth and scented powders. The lack of clean water and soap meant that even the most basic acts of cleanliness were fraught with risk. The water in the well could be contaminated, and the soap, if it existed, was a harsh, lye-based substance that was often more harmful than helpful. For a new bride, entering this world of filth and disease was a terrifying prospect. She was not only at risk of contracting a disease herself, but she was also responsible for the health of her new family. A bride was expected to oversee the household, and this included the health and well-being of her husband and future children. If a child became sick, she would be blamed. If her husband fell ill, it was her responsibility to care for him. The dread of disease was a constant weight on her shoulders, a silent threat that could strike at any moment. Childbirth, as we have discussed, was a major source of anxiety, and the lack of hygiene made it even more so. A midwife's hands, a birthing chair, and the linens in the birthing chamber were all potential sources of deadly infection. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection that could kill a new mother within days, was a major cause of death. The lack of understanding of how it spread made it impossible to prevent. The birthing chamber, a place of immense hope and joy, was also a death trap. The dread of childbirth was a universal experience, but for the noblewoman, it was a terror compounded by the knowledge that she was surrounded by invisible enemies that could take her life. The medieval world was a place of immense beauty and grandeur, but it was also a place of immense filth and disease. The grand feasts, the beautiful tapestries, and the grand castles were all built on a foundation of poor sanitation and a lack of medical knowledge. For the medieval woman, this was a constant source of dread, a silent enemy that could strike at any moment and take her life or the lives of her loved ones. But what about the food? What was the risk of foodborne illness, and how did a noblewoman's diet differ from that of a commoner? But what about the food? What was the risk of foodborne illness, and how did a noblewoman's diet differ from that of a commoner? The dread of the medieval woman extended far beyond the walls of her home. It seeped into her food, her water, and her very being. The noblewoman's life, while seemingly one of luxury, was a daily gamble with her health. The feast, a symbol of her husband's wealth and power, was a minefield of potential illness. The dread was not just of the unknown, but of the very real possibility that her next meal could be her last. The noblewoman's diet, while varied, was far from safe. The lack of refrigeration meant that meat and fish spoiled quickly. The spices that were used to mask the taste of spoiled food were not a luxury but a necessity. The bread, a staple of every meal, was often made with flour that was contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause a terrifying disease known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene, were a source of great fear and superstition. People believed that they were possessed by demons or that they were being punished by God. The water was another source of dread. The water in the wells and rivers was often contaminated with human and animal waste. People did not understand that drinking this water could make them sick. Instead, they would drink ale, wine, or cider, which were often safer because the fermentation process killed the bacteria. The noblewoman's diet was a mix of cooked and raw foods, and the risk of food poisoning was a constant threat. The lack of sanitation in the kitchen, the use of unwashed hands, and the presence of vermin all contributed to the spread of disease. The noblewoman's role in the household was to oversee the preparation of food. She was responsible for the health of her family, and if a member of her family became sick from contaminated food, she would be blamed. This was a heavy burden to bear, a constant source of anxiety that she had to carry with her every day. The dread of disease was a silent, invisible enemy that could strike at any moment and take her life or the lives of her loved ones. The feast, a symbol of joy and celebration, was a source of great anxiety for the medieval woman. She was not only expected to prepare the food, but she was also expected to eat it. The act of eating was a public spectacle, and she had to maintain a facade of composure even as she was surrounded by the constant threat of illness. The dread of disease was a silent companion at every meal, a reminder that her life was a constant gamble with her health. The story of the medieval woman is a story of a life lived under a constant state of dread. The dread of the wedding night, the dread of childbirth, and the dread of disease. Her life was a series of high-stakes gambles, with her body, her honor, and her family's future all on the line. The seemingly mundane details of daily life, the act of eating, the act of drinking, were, in fact, the most terrifying moments of her existence. They were a constant reminder that her life was not her own, but was a function of the laws, customs, and biological realities that governed her world. This is the unvarnished truth of medieval history, a history that is far more compelling and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. But what about the greatest plague of all? The Black Death. What was the dread of the medieval woman during this terrifying time, and how did it change her life forever? Section 3. The Great Dying. The terrifying arrival of the Black Death. The anxieties of the medieval woman, which we've so far explored, were personal and intimate. A dread of her wedding night, of childbirth, of contaminated food. But in the mid-14th century, this private terror was eclipsed by a public and universal one, the Black Death. This wasn't just an illness, it was an apocalypse, an event that would kill an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. For the medieval woman, the dread was no longer of a silent, invisible enemy in her own home, but of a swift and terrifying one that could wipe out her entire family in a matter of days. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was carried by fleas on black rats, which were ubiquitous in medieval towns and castles. The disease spread with astonishing speed, following trade routes and travel paths. Its symptoms were horrific: high fever, chills, and the appearance of black, swollen buboes in the armpits and groin. The mortality rate was staggeringly high, often reaching 80% or more. A person could go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. This was a fear on a scale that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. For the noblewoman, her status offered no protection. The plague struck down rich and poor alike. She was just as likely to contract the disease as the peasant in the field. But her anxiety was different. She had more to lose. The death of her husband, her children, her entire lineage was a very real possibility. She watched as her family members sickened and died, and there was nothing she could do. The fear was a constant, gnawing presence. Every cough from her child, every fever from her husband, was a terrifying reminder of the plague's unstoppable power. The plague also had a profound effect on the social fabric of the medieval world. The death of so many people led to a labor shortage, which in turn led to a rise in wages and a breakdown of the feudal system. For the woman, this meant that her position in society was in flux. She might find herself as a widow with property and no one to manage it. She might be forced to work in a trade that was once closed to her. The plague, in its own horrifying way, was a source of both terror and opportunity. But the most profound dread of the Black Death was the sheer sense of helplessness. People had no understanding of how the disease spread, and they believed it was a punishment from God for their sins. The medieval woman would have spent her days in prayer, hoping that her piety would save her family. She would have prayed to saints, gone on pilgrimages, and even self-flagellated in a desperate attempt to appease a wrathful God. But the prayers did little to stop the march of death. The Black Death was a terrifying culmination of all the fears and anxieties that a medieval woman lived with. It was the ultimate invisible enemy, a disease that could take her life and the lives of her loved ones in a matter of hours. The dread was not just of death, but of a world turned upside down, a world where the laws of man and God seemed to have failed. The plague left a lasting scar on the European psyche, a scar that would be felt for centuries to come. It was a terrifying reminder that no matter how powerful, how wealthy, or how pious a person was, they were utterly powerless in the face of nature's fury. Story 6. Beyond the Veil. Legal Rights and the Unexpected Power of the Medieval Widow. Section 1. The Unexpected Freedom. The Paradox of the Widow's Dower. We have explored the life of the medieval woman, a life defined by a series of anxieties and dangers, from the wedding night to the constant threat of disease. We have seen her as a pawn in a game of power and property, her body and her future a subject of legal and social scrutiny. But there was one group of women who, through the unfortunate circumstance of their husband's death, achieved an unexpected and often profound level of freedom and power: the medieval widow. This was a paradox. A woman's life was supposed to be in a state of coverture, her legal identity subsumed by her husband's. Yet, in widowhood, the veil of coverture was lifted, and she emerged as a legal entity in her own right, with a level of autonomy that was denied to her as a wife or a daughter. The foundation of the widow's power lay in the dower, that same financial instrument we touched upon in our first story. The dower was not a gift from the husband, but a legal right to a portion of his estate, typically 1/3, that was set aside for her use for the rest of her life. This was not just a means of survival, it was a source of independent wealth and power. The dower was legally protected, and it could not be taken from her by her husband's family or by the king. It was her security, her independence, and her unexpected path to freedom. For a woman who had spent her entire life under the legal control of a man, her father, then her husband, the dower was a revolutionary concept. She was no longer a ward of her husband's family. She was her own master. She could manage her own property, make her own financial decisions, and even sue in a court of law without the consent of a man. This was a level of legal agency that was almost unimaginable for a married woman. The widow's power was not just legal, it was also social. She was no longer under the control of her in-laws. She could choose where she lived, who she socialized with, and even whether or not to remarry. For a woman who had been a pawn in a game of dynastic chess, this was a breathtaking level of freedom. The widow was a unique figure in medieval society, a woman who had experienced the world of marriage and motherhood and had emerged with her own wealth and power. She was a source of respect and admiration, a woman who had survived the dangers of childbirth and the anxieties of marriage and had emerged victorious. This newfound freedom, however, was not without its own anxieties. The widow was a vulnerable figure. She was a woman without a man to protect her, and she was a target for those who sought to take her property or marry her for her dower. The dread of the widow was not of a forced marriage or an unfaithful husband, but of a different kind of predator. She had to be vigilant, shrewd, and cunning to protect her newfound freedom. The world, which had once been a source of terror, was now a source of opportunity and danger in equal measure. The widow's dread was a quiet one, a fear of losing her independence and her wealth. She had to navigate a world that was not built for her. She had to be a shrewd businesswoman, a cunning politician, and a vigilant guardian of her own interests. This was a far cry from the life she had been raised for. She was a woman who had survived the most brutal of life's challenges, and she had emerged with a newfound strength and a new set of anxieties. But what happened when a powerful noble family, desperate for her wealth, tried to force her into a new marriage? How did a medieval widow use her newfound legal power to resist the pressure to remarry and retain her independence? Section 2. The Marriage Market and the Widow's Power Play. The newfound freedom of the medieval widow was a dangerous and precarious position. She was a valuable commodity on the marriage market, a woman with her own wealth and property, and a target for noblemen and their families who sought to increase their own fortunes. The dread of the widow was not of a lack of a husband, but of a forced remarriage, a loss of her independence, and a return to the state of coverture that she had so recently escaped. Her life was a constant power play, a shrewd game of negotiation and legal maneuvering to protect her dower and her freedom. The legal and social pressure to remarry was immense. The king or the lord of her deceased husband could, in theory, grant her to a new husband of his choosing. A woman could petition the king to choose her own husband, but this was a privilege that was not always granted. A young and wealthy widow was a particularly valuable prize, and a powerful nobleman could go to great lengths to secure her as a bride for his son or a favored vassal. The widow's dread was of a forced marriage to a man she did not know or love, a man who would control her life and her fortune. But the medieval widow had a powerful weapon at her disposal, her dower. This was a legally protected asset, and no one, not even the king, could force her to give it up. She could use her dower as a bargaining chip, a way to negotiate a new marriage on her own terms. She could demand that her new husband sign a prenuptial agreement that would protect her dower and her right to manage her own property. This was a level of legal power that was almost unimaginable for a married woman. She was not a passive pawn, but an active participant in her own destiny. The story of the medieval widow is a story of incredible resilience and cunning. She had to be a master of negotiation and a shrewd businesswoman. She had to be able to manage her own estate, deal with tenants and vassals, and protect her interests from greedy family members and ambitious noblemen. She had to be a woman who was not afraid to go to court, to stand up for her rights, and to fight for her freedom. The dread of the widow was a constant companion, but it was a fear that she had learned to live with and to overcome. The widow's dread was a fear of losing her independence, of being subsumed by a new husband and his family. She had to be vigilant, shrewd, and cunning to protect her newfound freedom. She had to be a woman who was not afraid to say no, to refuse a marriage proposal, and to fight for her right to remain a single woman. The medieval world was a man's world, but the widow was a unique figure who had found a way to navigate it on her own terms. She was a woman who had survived the most brutal of life's challenges, and she had emerged with a newfound strength and a new set of anxieties. The legal status of the widow was a paradox. She was a woman without a man to protect her, but she was also a woman who had a level of legal agency that was denied to her as a wife or a daughter. She was a source of respect and admiration, a woman who had survived the dangers of childbirth and the anxieties of marriage and had emerged victorious. She was a woman who had found a way to be herself in a world that was not built for her. But what happened when a noblewoman, a woman of immense wealth and power, used her status as a widow to become a powerful political figure in her own right? How did a woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine, a twice-widowed queen, use her newfound freedom to become one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe? Section 3. The Widow as Ruler, from Personal Freedom to Political Power. The final and most remarkable stage in the medieval widow's journey was her transformation from a woman with newfound personal freedom to a woman of immense political power. The death of her husband, a seemingly tragic event, could in fact be the very thing that allowed her to emerge from the shadows of coverture and step onto the stage of history. For a woman of high nobility or royal lineage, the dower and the widowhood became a legal and social springboard to a level of influence that was often denied to her as a wife. This was a transition from a private to a public life, from managing a household to ruling a realm. The most famous example of this is Eleanor of Aquitaine. Twice a queen, first of France and then of England, Eleanor was a woman of immense power. But it was in her widowhood that her power truly crystallized. When her husband, Henry II of England, died, she was no longer under his control. She had her own extensive dower lands in England and, most importantly, her inherited Duchy of Aquitaine. As a widow, she was the sole legal ruler of her own vast territory. She was not a queen consort. She was a duchess in her own right, a sovereign ruler who could raise armies, collect taxes, and forge alliances. Her sons, including the future King Richard the Lionheart and King John, were her vassals, not her masters. This was a complete inversion of the traditional power dynamic. For a medieval woman, the anxieties of life were all about control, the lack of it. But for a powerful widow, the control was hers. She could manage her own affairs, and more importantly, she could influence the affairs of state. A powerful widow could serve as a regent for her young son, a role that gave her de facto control of the kingdom. She could negotiate treaties, command armies, and make decisions that would shape the course of history. Her life was no longer about survival and a quiet dread. It was about power and a public stage. The story of the medieval widow is not just a story of legal rights and personal freedom. It is a story of a woman who, through the tragic circumstances of her husband's death, found a way to transcend the limitations of her gender and her time. She was a woman who was a testament to the idea that even in the most rigid of social structures, there was a path to power and influence. The dread of the wedding night and the terror of childbirth were all part of a woman's journey, but they were a journey that could lead to a final and unexpected destination, a life of power and influence. The legacy of the medieval widow is a powerful one. She was a woman who, in her own quiet way, challenged the patriarchy and redefined the role of a woman in society. She was a woman who showed that strength and resilience could be found in the most unexpected of places. The history of the medieval woman is a history of immense suffering and profound strength. It is a history that is not always pretty and not always glorious, but it is a history that is deeply human and profoundly important. The boring details of legal documents and social customs reveal a world that was far more complex and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. And in the end, it is in these quiet, unwritten stories that we find the most compelling truths about our shared past. Story 7. The Medieval Nun, the Convent as a Refuge and a Prison Section. 1. The Veiled Escape, the Convent as a Last Resort. We've explored the dreads of marriage, childbirth, and disease, but for some medieval women, the greatest dread was the life itself, a life dictated by men and social convention. For these women, the convent offered a paradoxical sanctuary. It was both a refuge from the dangers of the world and a prison of its own making. The decision to become a nun was often not a choice but a last resort, a way for a family to dispose of an unmarriageable daughter or a woman to escape a forced marriage. The convent was a place of safety and security. It offered a woman an escape from the dangers of childbirth, the anxieties of marriage, and the constant threat of disease. It was a place where she could live a life of piety and devotion, a life that was not dictated by the whims of a man. The convent was a world of women, a community that offered a sense of sisterhood and support. It was a place where a woman could be herself, a place where her mind and her soul were more important than her body and her reproductive capacity. But the convent was also a prison. It was a life of solitude and isolation, a life that was cut off from the outside world. The nun was a woman who had given up her personal freedom and her right to a family. She was a bride of Christ, a woman who had made a lifelong vow of celibacy and poverty. The dread of the nun was not of the physical world, but of the spiritual. She was a woman who had given up her life for God, and she had to live with the constant fear that she was not worthy of His love. The decision to become a nun was a complex one, a decision that was often not made by the woman herself. A family might send a daughter to a convent because they could not afford a dowry for her, or because she was considered unsuitable for marriage. A woman might seek refuge in a convent to escape a forced marriage, a violent husband, or the dangers of childbirth. The convent was a place of safety and security, but it was a place that came with a price. The dread of the nun was a quiet one, a fear of a life of solitude and isolation, a life that was cut off from the outside world. She was a woman who had given up her personal freedom and her right to a family. She was a woman who had made a lifelong vow of celibacy and poverty. The dread of the nun was not of the physical world, but of the spiritual. She was a woman who had given up her life for God, and she had to live with the constant fear that she was not worthy of his love. But what happened when a woman of immense wealth and power, was forced to enter a convent? How did a woman like Heloise, a famous scholar and writer, use her status as a nun to become one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe? Section 2. The Scholarly Convent and the Power of the Pen. The convent, while a refuge for some, was also a place of intellectual and spiritual flourishing for others. For a woman of intellect and ambition, a woman who sought a life beyond the domestic sphere, the convent was a unique and powerful institution. It was a place where she could learn to read and write, to study theology and philosophy, and to become a scholar in her own right. The dread of the nun was not of a lack of purpose, but of a lack of a male audience for her work. The convent was a place of immense learning and intellectual debate. Nuns were often more literate than their male counterparts, and they were at the forefront of the intellectual and spiritual life of the time. They were scholars, writers, and theologians, women who were not afraid to challenge the doctrines of the Church and to speak their minds. The convent was a place where a woman's intellect was valued, a place where she could pursue a life of learning and scholarship. The most famous example of this is Hildegard of Bingen. She was a German abbess, a writer, a composer, a philosopher, a Christian mystic, a visionary, and a polymath. She wrote theological, botanical, and medicinal texts, as well as letters, liturgical songs, and poems. She was a woman of immense power and influence, a woman who was not afraid to challenge the authority of bishops and popes. Her life was a testament to the fact that a woman could achieve greatness in a world that was not built for her. The dread of the nun was not of a lack of purpose, but of a lack of a male audience for her work. Her scholarship, her writing, and her music were often confined to the walls of the convent. She was a woman who was a powerful voice, but her voice was often not heard outside of her own community. This was a source of great frustration and a quiet dread. She was a woman who had a lot to say, but her words were often lost to the world. The story of the medieval nun is not just a story of a life of solitude and isolation. It is a story of a life of immense intellectual and spiritual flourishing. It is a story of a woman who, in a world that was not built for her, found a way to be herself. The dread of the nun was a quiet one, a fear of a life of solitude and isolation, a life that was cut off from the outside world. But it was a fear that she had learned to live with and to overcome. She was a woman who had found a way to be herself in a world that was not built for her. But what happened when a nun, a woman who had taken a vow of poverty and celibacy, was forced to confront the world of politics and power? How did a woman like Teresa of Avila, a famous mystic and writer, use her status as a nun to become a powerful political figure in her own right? Section 3. The Reformer and the Politician. The nun as a force of change. The final stage of the medieval nun's journey was her transformation from a woman of contemplation to a woman of action. The convent, while a refuge for some, was also a place of immense political power. A wealthy and well-connected abbess could be a powerful political figure in her own right, a woman who could negotiate with kings and popes. The dread of the nun was not of a lack of purpose, but of a lack of a male audience for her work. The convent was a place of immense political power. A wealthy abbess could control vast estates, and she could use her wealth and influence to support her family or to influence the political decisions of her time. The abbess was a woman who was a ruler in her own right, a woman who had a level of political power that was almost unimaginable for a married woman. She was a woman who had found a way to be herself in a world that was not built for her. The most famous example of this is Teresa of Avila. She was a Spanish Carmelite nun and a prominent Spanish mystic, writer, and a theologian of the Catholic Church. She was a woman who, in a time of immense political and religious turmoil, used her status as a nun to become a powerful political figure. She was a woman who was not afraid to challenge the authority of bishops and popes, a woman who had a powerful voice and who was not afraid to use it. Her life was a testament to the fact that a woman could achieve greatness in a world that was not built for her. The dread of the nun was a quiet one, a fear of a life of solitude and isolation, a life that was cut off from the outside world. But it was a fear that she had learned to live with and to overcome. She was a woman who had found a way to be herself in a world that was not built for her. The history of the medieval nun is a history of immense suffering and profound strength. It is a history that is not always pretty and not always glorious, but it is a history that is deeply human and profoundly important. The boring details of legal documents and social customs reveal a world that was far more complex and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. And in the end, it is in these quiet, unwritten stories that we find the most compelling truths about our shared past. Story 9. The Unseen Threat. Superstition, Charms, and Witchcraft. Section 1. The world of whispers and malevolent intent. We have explored the physical and legal anxieties of the medieval woman, but now we'll delve into a more insidious, a more pervasive dread. One that lived in the shadows and was as much a part of the air she breathed as the smoke from the hearth. This was the dread of the unseen threat, the fear of curses, of malevolent spirits, and of witchcraft. The medieval mind saw the world as a place where the spiritual was just as real and just as present as the physical. For a woman, a sudden crop failure, a cow's unexpected death, or a child's inexplicable sickness were not just random misfortunes. They were often attributed to the deliberate, malicious will of an enemy. This was a world where a woman's life was an endless series of defensive rituals. She would wear amulets to ward off the evil eye, a malevolent glance believed to cause harm or bad luck. These could be as simple as a piece of consecrated bread or a relic of a saint, or as complex as an intricately carved charm of bone or wood. She would recite specific prayers for protection from curses and a litany of incantations for every possible danger. A simple blessing over a newborn child was as much a plea for divine protection as it was a gesture of love. The home was a fortress against these unseen forces. Salt, a symbol of purity and preservation, would be scattered around the threshold to keep spirits out. The sign of the cross would be etched into the doors and windows. The very act of baking bread was a ritual, with a cross often scored into the loaf before it went into the oven. A final blessing against a world filled with demons and spirits. For the medieval woman, this was not superstition. It was a daily, practical matter of survival. She was the primary guardian of her family's spiritual well-being, and the burden of protecting her loved ones from unseen forces fell squarely on her shoulders. But the most terrifying part of this unseen world was the possibility of a direct attack. A woman could live her entire life in quiet piety, only to find her family struck by a sudden and inexplicable misfortune. A child might fall ill with a fever that no herbal remedy could cure. A husband might become impotent, rendering the marriage useless. In a world with no understanding of germs or psychological conditions, these were signs of something darker at work, the work of a witch. The term witchcraft in the medieval period was a fluid and terrifying concept. It was not a grand satanic pact, but a subtle act of malice, often born of envy or resentment. A neighbor who held a grudge could cast a spell on a woman's dairy, causing the milk to curdle. A rival for a man's affection could bewitch him, rendering him unable to consummate his marriage. The dread was not just of the act of witchcraft itself, but of the terrifying knowledge that it could be perpetrated by someone she knew, a seemingly ordinary woman who had a power she did not understand. The anxiety was not just about protecting her family from witches, but also about the terrifying possibility of being accused of witchcraft herself. For a woman who was a little too eccentric, a little too outspoken, or a little too skilled in the use of herbs, the fear of an accusation was a quiet, constant presence. The very tools she used to heal her family could be misinterpreted as instruments of dark magic. Her knowledge of herbs could be seen as a pact with the devil. Her status as a healer, a cunning woman, was a double-edged sword. She was a source of comfort for some, but a source of suspicion for many. But what happened when a woman who had lived her entire life in quiet piety, was finally accused of witchcraft? What was the terrible process of a public accusation? And what was the dread of the medieval woman who was at the heart of it all? Section 2. The dread of the accusation. The whispers begin quietly. A neighbor's cow dies. A child falls ill with a strange rash. A man's luck turns sour. The community, desperate for an explanation, looks for a source of the misfortune. They look for the eccentric woman on the edge of the village, the woman who lives alone, the woman who has an uncanny knowledge of herbs. The whispers turn into murmurs, the murmurs into open accusations. For the accused, this was the beginning of a living nightmare. The dread of the unseen enemy was replaced by the terrifying reality of a very visible and very public one. The accusation of witchcraft was a slow and terrifying process. It was a descent into a world where logic and reason had no place. The first step was the social ostracism. A woman who was accused of witchcraft was shunned by her community. No one would buy her goods. No one would speak to her. She was a pariah, a woman who was a source of fear and revulsion. Her reputation, once her most valuable asset, was now her greatest liability. The legal process was even more terrifying. The medieval witch trials were not a matter of a fair and just legal system. They were a matter of public opinion and fear. The proofs used to convict a witch were often illogical and cruel. One of the most common was the swimming test. A woman who was accused of witchcraft would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If she floated, it was a sign that she was a witch, as the pure water of God would reject her. If she sank, it was a sign that she was innocent. But she would often drown in the process. The search for the devil's mark was another terrifying ordeal. The accused would be stripped naked, and her body would be searched for a birthmark, a mole, or a wart. Any blemish that could be a sign of a pact with the devil. A woman who was a witch was believed to be unable to feel pain, and a pin would be jabbed into the mark to see if she bled or cried out. The entire process was a public humiliation, a violation of her body and her dignity. The dread of the accused was not just of the physical torture but of the spiritual. She was a woman who was believed to have sold her soul to the devil. She was a woman who was a source of evil and a threat to the entire community. The fear was a quiet, insidious one, a fear that she was not worthy of God's love. She was a woman who was a prisoner of her own time, a woman who was a victim of a social ideal. The dread of the woman was a quiet, insidious one, a fear that she was a source of evil and a threat to the entire community. The medieval woman who was accused of witchcraft was a pawn in a game of power and fear. She was a woman who was a testament to the tragic consequences of a cultural ideal. The seemingly mundane details of daily life, the act of buying and selling, the act of speaking to a neighbor, reveal a world that was far more complex and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. But what happened when the accused was convicted? What was the terrible final act of a medieval witch trial? And what was the legacy of fear that it left behind? Section 3. The Scourge and the Warning. The Legacy of Fear. The final and most terrifying act of a medieval witch trial was the public execution. A woman who was convicted of witchcraft would be burned at the stake. The fire, it was believed, would purify her soul and prevent her from returning to haunt the living. The execution was a public spectacle, a grim and brutal form of entertainment that was meant to serve as a warning to the community. It was a terrifying reminder of the consequences of a life lived outside the norms of society. For the women who watched the execution, the dread was a quiet, insidious one. It was a fear that lived in the back of their minds, a fear that they could be next. The story of the witch served as a powerful form of social control. It was a warning to women to be obedient, to be submissive, and to not be too independent. It was a way to enforce the social order and to keep women in their place. The fear of witchcraft was a powerful tool that was used to control women and to ensure that they did not challenge the authority of men. The legacy of the medieval witch trials was a profound and lasting one. It was a legacy of fear and suspicion, a legacy that would be felt for centuries to come. The dread of the medieval woman was a quiet, insidious one, a fear that she was a source of evil and a threat to the entire community. She was a woman who was a prisoner of her own time, a woman who was a victim of a social ideal. The seemingly mundane details of daily life, the act of buying and selling, the act of speaking to a neighbor, reveal a world that was far more complex and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. The history of the medieval witch trials is not a story of a woman's vanity. It is a story of a woman's desperation to fit in, to be beautiful, to be accepted. It is a story of a woman who was a prisoner of her own time, a woman who was a victim of a social ideal. The dread of the woman was a quiet, insidious one, a fear that she was a source of evil and a threat to the entire community. She was a woman who was a testament to the tragic consequences of a cultural ideal. The seemingly mundane details of daily life, the act of putting on makeup, reveal a world that was far more complex and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. And in the end, it is in these quiet, unwritten stories that we find the most compelling truths about our shared past.
Story 10. The Alewife and the Brewer's License. The Hidden Dreads of a Medieval Entrepreneur. Section 1. The Brewing of Life and Livelihood. We have spent our time with the anxieties of queens and noblewomen, but now we will descend from the high halls of the castle and into the bustling, noisy, and often precarious world of the medieval village. Here, a woman's dread was not of a forced marriage or a legal document, but of a bad harvest, a spoiled batch, and a reputation that could be ruined with a single, whispered word. Our focus is on the alewife, a figure so common in medieval society that she was almost invisible, and a woman whose economic independence was a source of both pride and profound anxiety. In the Middle Ages, brewing ale was considered a woman's job, a domestic chore performed in the home. It was as common as baking bread. The ingredients were simple: water, malted barley, and yeast. The process was laborious and physical, a cycle of mashing, boiling, and fermenting that could take days. But the reward was immense. Ale was not just a drink. It was a staple of the medieval diet, a safe alternative to often contaminated water. It was a source of nutrition and sustenance, and the demand for it was constant. For many women, brewing was their sole source of income. It was a way for a widow to support herself and her children. It was a way for a married woman to supplement her husband's meager earnings. It was a path to a rare kind of economic independence. An alewife was a business owner, a supplier of a vital commodity. She could set her own hours, manage her own finances, and be her own boss. This was a level of autonomy that was almost unimaginable for a woman of the time. But this independence was a fragile thing. A bad batch of ale could mean financial ruin. If the yeast didn't work, if the water was contaminated, or if the malt was poor, the entire batch would be ruined. A woman's reputation as a brewer was her most valuable asset. If her ale was considered sour or thin, her customers would go elsewhere. A single mistake could destroy a business that had taken years to build. The dread of the alewife was a fear that was tied directly to her livelihood. It was a fear that she could lose everything with a single, bad decision. The alewife's life was also a life of constant social scrutiny. Her home was a public space, a tavern of sorts, where customers would come and go. She was a woman who was a central figure in her community, a woman who was a source of news and gossip. But this public life came with a price. She was a target for slander and gossip. A competitor could spread a rumor that her ale was poisoned. A disgruntled customer could accuse her of witchcraft. The dread was not just of a bad batch, but of a bad word, a single, whispered accusation that could destroy her reputation and her livelihood. The alewife, in her apron and with a mug in her hand, was a symbol of women's economic power in the medieval period. She was a woman who was a business owner, a provider, and a vital member of her community. But her power was a fragile thing, a power that was always under threat from a variety of sources. Her dread was a constant companion, a fear that she could lose everything with a single bad decision or a single malicious word. But the most significant threat to the alewife was not a bad batch or a competitor's slander. It was a new, organized force that was beginning to assert its power over her livelihood. The male-dominated guilds were beginning to emerge, and they had a very specific agenda: to control the production of ale. What happened to the alewife when she was forced to confront a legal and institutional system that sought to take away her very means of survival? Section 2. The Slanderer's Whisper and the Guild's Iron Grip. The alewife's quiet dread of a bad batch was soon overshadowed by a more insidious, a more powerful threat: the organized efforts of men to take control of her profession. As the brewing of ale became more profitable and moved from the domestic sphere into a commercial enterprise, it attracted the attention of male-dominated guilds. These guilds, with their formal regulations, their apprenticeships, and their political power, saw the alewife not as a peer, but as an unprofessional competitor who needed to be controlled, or better yet, eliminated. The rise of the male brewers' guilds was a slow and systematic assault on the economic independence of women. The guilds began to push for regulations that were designed to favor men and exclude women. They would mandate that ale be brewed in a specific way, using a specific type of equipment that was often too expensive for a woman to purchase. They would require apprenticeships, a process that was largely closed to women. They would impose fees and taxes on brewers, a financial burden that was often too heavy for a woman to bear. The alewife, a woman who had once been her own boss, was now a pawn in a game of legal and economic control. The dread of the alewife was no longer a fear of a bad batch. It was a fear of the law, of a system that was slowly and systematically dismantling her livelihood. The guilds would send inspectors to her home to test her ale, a public humiliation that was meant to intimidate her and to assert their authority. If her ale was found to be wanting, she could be fined, or worse, she could be forbidden from brewing. The dread was of a legal system that was rigged against her, a system that was designed to take away her livelihood and her independence. The most insidious weapon used against the alewife was slander. She was a woman who was a central figure in her community, a woman who was a source of news and gossip. The male brewers, in their quest to eliminate her, would use this to their advantage. They would spread rumors that her ale was watered down, that she was dishonest, or that she was a witch. The dread was not just of a bad batch, but of a bad word, a single, whispered accusation that could destroy her reputation and her livelihood. The very things that made her a successful businesswoman, her independence, her public presence, her knowledge of her craft, were used against her. The image of the alewife, with her tall hat and her brewing ladle, was a powerful one in medieval art and literature. But this image, which we see in illuminated manuscripts and on tapestries, often has a hidden dark side. The woman is often depicted with a sinister look on her face, a hint that her trade is not entirely honest or respectable. This was a form of propaganda, a way for male-dominated society to cast suspicion on a woman who was too independent, a woman who was too powerful. But what was the final and most powerful tool used to dismantle the alewife's livelihood? What was the symbolic end of an era, a final act of control that would forever change the face of ale brewing? Section 3. The stake, the symbol, and the end of an era. The final and most symbolic act of control over the alewife's profession was the ale stake. This was a pole, often with a garland of greenery, that was placed outside the home of an alewife to signify that her ale was ready for sale. It was a simple public sign, a way for a woman to announce her presence in the marketplace. It was a symbol of her independence, her skill, and her livelihood. But as the male-dominated guilds gained power, they began to regulate the use of the ale stake. The alewife was no longer allowed to simply put out her sign when her ale was ready. She had to pay a fee to the guild. She had to submit her ale for inspection by a male ale taster. The very symbol of her independence became a tool of her oppression. The dread of the alewife was no longer a fear of a bad batch, but a fear of the inspector, a fear of a man who could, with a single taste, shut down her business. The image of the alewife with her tall hat and her ale stake is a haunting one. It is a symbol of a woman who was a business owner, a provider, and a vital member of her community. But it is also a symbol of a woman who was a victim of a system that was designed to take away her livelihood and her independence. The decline of the alewife was a slow and systematic process, a process that was a testament to the power of a male-dominated society to control women and to dismantle their economic independence. The history of the alewife is not a story of a woman's vanity. It is a story of a woman's desperation to fit in, to be beautiful, to be accepted. It is a story of a woman who was a prisoner of her own time, a woman who was a victim of a social ideal. The dread of the woman was a quiet, insidious one, a fear that she was a source of evil and a threat to the entire community. She was a woman who was a testament to the tragic consequences of a cultural ideal. The seemingly mundane details of daily life, the act of brewing ale, reveal a world that was far more complex and far more terrifying than the romantic tales of knights and ladies. The story of the medieval alewife is a powerful reminder that even in the most seemingly mundane of professions, there is a hidden history of struggle, of resilience, and of profound social change. It is a history that is not always pretty and not always glorious, but it is a history that is deeply human and profoundly important. It is a history that is a testament to the idea that even in the most rigid of social structures, a woman could find a way to be herself, to be a business owner, and to be a force of change. And in the end, it is in these quiet, unwritten stories that we find the most compelling truths about our shared past.